We're going to talk about anxiety disorders now as a class. Now we have as a class of disorders and as a class of people here in this course. We've already talked a good bit about anxiety disorders because it was very relevant when we looked back at learning autonomic nervous system, fight or flight, and when we looked back in the behavioral and learning and the acquisition of phobias and things of that nature. So we've already talked about this a good bit, but we'll talk about it again because it's the #1 issue that people deal with, right? And a lot of people deal with multiple issues simultaneously. So let's look at the different anxiety disorders, and they've changed. They've changed. So what I'm telling you about these general classes of disorders have not changed. They've moved some of them around, but the essence of what we're talking about remains the same. So fret not that we're not totally in sync with DSM-5. We are not so far out of sync at an intro level that there's any significant changes here. Right? If you become a professional who does diagnostics, you'll want to become very intimate with the DSM-5, as I am becoming now. It's still in play for the next year because it takes a long time to switch an entire profession over from one system to another system. Even small changes can make big changes in terms of how you conduct your work. Thus, this one you should be very familiar with already. Phobic disorder. Phobic disorder for adults is by definition irrational. They know that the fear that they have is out of proportion with the actual danger that they might find themselves in. That frequently there is no objective danger or minimal objective danger, but it's a powerful fear nonetheless. It's a persistent fear. It recurs. It can be situation specific. It usually is situation specific. That's why it's a phobia. If there's no situation that seems to predispose it, we might call it panic disorder. But the equivalent here is that some situation or object causes the equivalent of a panic response in the person, and that they then learn to avoid the situations that cause that feeling, which would be part of the two-factor theory, right? They somehow acquired classically conditioning. They acquired an adrenaline response to what was a previously neutral situation, but then they learn to avoid that situation such that they never extinguish the classically conditioned fear response, right? And so it gets maintained sometimes for a lifetime. People who have fears that they can't explain where they got them, lasting for a lifetime, leading to then some distress. Now, in a lot of cases, a lot of people have phobias that don't impact their daily life in any way that's significant. And so they go about their days unaffected by this. They just simply avoid situations, but they don't impact their life. But let's say you have a fear of heights, for example, or enclosed spaces, and you're offered a job on the 107th floor of a large office building in a downtown metro area. You may not be able to take that job or even get to that interview if your phobia is so severe that it prevents you from going into that building and going up that elevator. And you don't want to climb 107 flights of stairs, right? That could then impact your life. I saw a case cured through a thing called flooding, the systematic flooding, which we'll talk about a little bit, of a woman who had a deep and desperate fear of snakes, right? And she lived in Europe in an area where there were no real snake problems to be spoke of. So most of her day is fine. So you would say, well, why does she care? Why would she go to treatment for that? Because her family liked to go camping. And her fear was so profound that even knowing that A, she was not likely to encounter a snake, B, if she did encounter a snake, it wouldn't likely bite her, C, if it did bite her, it wouldn't likely be poisonous, and D, if it did bite her and was poisonous, she'd probably survive through treatment. She couldn't go camping. She could not do it. And as such, it kept her from enjoying parts of her life with her family. So she sought treatment in that sense. But for a lot of people, if it doesn't affect your life, you don't need to get treatment. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with you. In fact, as we've talked before, these are normal human processes, right? We learn to avoid that which causes fight or flight responses because that's usually adaptive. It's a survival mechanism. Panic disorder we've already talked about, and that's where there's not necessarily a specific object, although there could be situations that predispose one to panic. But phobia is a specific situation or specific object that causes it reliably. Whereas panic disorder is a much broader thing that can occur seemingly out of the blue. For the person experiencing it, they have a full-on fight or flight response, but they don't know what's causing it. With a phobia, if you have a desperate fear of flying, the closer you get to getting on the plane, the more adrenaline gets released, and you know what's causing that. There's a very clear stimulus causing a very clear response, and the phobia is known, and the person knows, well, it's safer to fly than to drive. That, right? No amount of rationality, forebrain activity negates the base brain reaction of avoid this, get away from this, run away from this. All right? With panic attack, it's not that clear usually. Now, there could be situations that come to produce panics, like going to stores, for example, or driving, for example, or certain kinds of interactions, or going to work, for example. But usually that's not how it starts. It starts seemingly out of the blue. Now, y'all now know it didn't come out of the blue. There was some kind of trigger somewhere in this person's life that they acquired through a classically conditioned process that probably set off that initial flutter. But we'll talk about what happens after the initial flutter next time. Y'all have a wonderful day. Enjoy that sunshine. We left off in the middle of several anxiety disorders that we were talking about, and some disorders that have been reclassified. Remember, we talked about the DSM-5, which you want to know for your test, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. New edition, they changed things up. As such, category shift, and we'll talk about those a little bit. You won't need to know those category shifts for your test. We're really talking about broad categories of issues and disorders, and that's what I want you to know, is these broad kinds of conceptualizations. So if you see on your test a description of somebody and some symptoms that they might be experiencing or some difficulties they might be experiencing, you should be able to know these well enough that you go, oh, that's panic disorder, not phobia. Or you go, oh, yes, that's phobia, not panic disorder. I know it well enough to distinguish between the two, given a pretty clear-cut pattern of symptoms that are displayed. So in panic disorder, where we left off, we were talking about how in phobic disorder, you have anxiety attacks and possibly panic attacks, but they are very specifically linked to some stimulus, a situation, objects. Could be fear of dogs, fear of flying, fear of small spaces, fear of anything that might be linked to an adrenaline response. Classical conditioning occurs, fires it up. People learn to avoid that. Therefore, it doesn't extinguish, and that's why it oftentimes lasts for a lifetime unless treated. Panic disorder, the panic experience seems to come out of the blue, at least at times. It may eventually come to be triggered by certain situations, but it also occurs in other kinds of situations where there doesn't seem to the person who's experiencing it to be a very clear cause. They don't tie it together. It just seems to them that it comes out of the blue, out of nowhere. Now, you know that there's probably a classically conditioned trigger that they just aren't aware of in the environment that's initiating it. It might even be internal. A worry about being evaluated negatively might start a heart palpitation, and that heart palpitation might trigger the worry that brings on a more expanded anxiety or fight or flight response. But it becomes a problem because the apprehension and fear is so bad that people have a hard time staying in situations and they leave them. And then those situations can become predispositions for additional attacks. And eventually, linking together through classical conditioning, may have started in one place and then you experience it in another place, and that type of place, say a store, now causes attacks. Maybe being in a car seems to cause attacks. Well, you can see how it's harder and harder to go places, and people start retreating backwards, and they start getting closer and closer to the only place they feel safe, which is oftentimes the home. And that's what agoraphobia is, a severe limitation on a person's freedom of movement due to the suffering they experience from anxiety attacks. Then they're not just sitting home kicking back. They feel terrible. Usually they feel very much cheated out of life and opportunities to do things all of us like to do. And additionally, they still have panic attacks. It's just a place they feel the safest to have those attacks. Because agoraphobia, for the layperson, is fear of being in public places. That's not what it is. That's panic disorder, PD. And that's what the DO stands for, is disorder. All right? It's not actually fear of being in public places. It's fear of being in a situation from which escape would be difficult or embarrassing if one had a panic attack, which would of course include public places, but it would also include private places like being in a car. If you had a panic attack in a car while driving, it'd be very difficult to escape that situation. And that's what it really is. But for the purposes of your test and general knowledge, you now know what that means and why it's said to be a fear of public places, because it goes back to the Greek root of agoraphobia. I think it has to do with marketplace. I'm not a speaker of Greek, but that's my understanding of the root.